Well, welcome to you all. I should mention this is the 15th anniversary of the American Interest. Our first issue came out in 2005, in August of 2005, under our founding editor, Adam Garfinkel. Since then, we've had the privilege to operate under the editorial leadership of Francis Fukuyama, which has been both a privilege and a pleasure. Frank?
Okay, thank you very much, Charles and Jeff. So it's really a pleasure to be able to do this American Interest event. I'd like to thank Jeff in particular. I think he's done a spectacular job as the editor. Adam really put this whole enterprise on a terrific basis, and Jeff has expanded the reach with all of the events that they've been doing in Washington and now online. And I think it also, there's other things that have happened in the American Interest. We founded the American Interest in 2005 in the wake of the Iraq War, because it seemed to us that a huge gap had opened up between the way that Americans saw the world and the way that other people in other parts of the world were looking at things. And that lack of understanding and communications was one of the reasons we created the magazine. So we said that we're going to try to explain the world to the United States, which is what other foreign policy-oriented magazines do, but importantly, to try to explain the United States to the rest of the world. And I must say that in the 15 years that have passed, that job has become even harder, because in many respects, the U.S., to me at least, has become something very hard to explain to anybody. The other thing that I think we've tried to do in the last couple of years is to shift a little bit our political emphasis. We had always said that we were, decidedly centrist. We weren't going to take strong ideological positions, or the magazine as a whole wouldn't represent a strong ideological position. But I think with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, that position has become a little bit problematic. Even as a political scientist and a Stanford senior fellow, we have academic freedom to say whatever we want. But the university really doesn't like professors to take strongly what it regards as partisan positions. But it seems to me that if you're a student of global democracy and democratic institutions, it's not just a partisan position like saying, well, should our tax rate be higher or lower, to be critical of some of the things that have been happening under the Trump administration in the last few years. Because I think that, if you just look at the actions, for example, of the Justice Department in rescinding the indictment of Michael Flynn, or the case against Michael Flynn, there's a much deeper threat to democracy that's going on. It's a fundamental threat to basic institutions. And among my conservative friends, some of them have really made the switch wholeheartedly. The never Trump Republicans like Bill Kristol are now among his most vocal critics. But there's another group that basically, haven't been willing to stand up and talk about what I think is the biggest threat to American democracy and global democracy, today, which is, I think, the President of the United States. And so we didn't want to be neutral on that issue. And I think that's been an important focus, as well as focusing on American domestic political institutions, because I think that most Americans have taken for granted something like the checks and balances of their constitutional system, because up till now those haven't been really threatened, in terrible ways. But I think right now we're seeing the value of having those checks and balances, and that is what brings me to the topic of the article that I wrote, which is about American political decay. Now, I had written about this in my last, it was the penultimate book that I wrote, Political Order and Political Decay, which was published in 2014. And it basically argued that the American political system was undergoing decay. And I think the reason for that is in the confluence of two phenomenon. So the first phenomenon is the American system of checks and balances. Compared to a Westminster system or other kinds of European parliamentary systems, the United States Constitution really spreads power out very, very widely. So you have three branches of government, you have a very powerful upper house of Congress, you have federalism that distributes power to lower levels of government. And all of that is really designed to protect against the kind of situation we're in now, a kind of American Caesarism, where you get one individual who wants to accumulate a lot of power personally, not even institutionally, but just personally, and therefore attacks those other checks in the system. Now, that system worked pretty well throughout the 20th century because the United States, despite these checks and balances, still managed to pass major legislation, the New Deal, the Great Society, the Civil Rights legislation. But in the last couple of decades, that system has come grinding to a halt because the system of checks and balances started meshing with social changes, which really had to do with the growing polarization in the country. This really began in the 1990s and accelerated after the financial crisis in 2008. And as many people point out, it wasn't a symmetric polarization. There's been a shift, clearly to the left on the Democratic Party, represented by Bernie Sanders, but the real thing that changed was a shift by the Republican Party to a position that was very unfamiliar to, Reagan Republicans, in which, the state itself became the enemy for a lot of the Tea Party wing of the party, and then, its capture by the Trump wing that was kind of an identitarian right-wing nationalist group. And that's led to, I think the current crisis that we're in where, fundamental decisions are really deadlocked. We've had repeated crises over the budget. Just passing a yearly budget has become a big slog. And I think it's now reflected in the current coronavirus crisis that we're facing. Now, if you look back at the causes of this polarization, it does, I think there's been a lot of writing about this, which is largely correct. Its origin lies in the Southern realignment in the 1960s, because prior to that, the Democratic Party had been a party of progressive, trade unionists and urban, professionals and so forth. But it was also connected to all these Southern racists, and that was actually an important base of the Democratic Party during the New Deal. But after the adoption of the civil rights agenda by the Democratic Party in the 1960s, the Republicans began collecting a lot of disaffected white voters in the South, and that's a process that unfolded over the next 20 years. And I think it kind of lays the basis for the shift from an ideological definition of the two parties, which it had been over limited government and economic policy, between a kind of fairly familiar left-right polarization to now a polarization that's increasingly based on identity, where the Democratic Party represents, white, educated professionals plus various racial minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, the LGBT community, and so forth. And that, I think, is that kind of identity-based polarization is very problematic. So one of the big issues, and by the way, this is, a huge source of weakness for the United States, because if you think about, how, for example, our rivals and enemies like Russia and China are dealing with us, they're trying to exploit this division, and they've done it extremely effectively in different ways. So I think that if you don't solve this underlying social and political problem, the country is actually never going to return to, operating effectively. Now, how do you do that? Well, I think the main way is political. I think that in a functioning democracy, which I think we still are, the main antidote to this kind of populist nationalism is an election. It's just a very simple principle that the way you stop the rise of these kinds of groups is by winning an election decisively. And in that regard, I think that there's actually a pretty good chance of the Democrats not just retaking the presidency, but also retaking the Senate and controlling those three branches of government after November. And the reason obviously has to do with the current crisis. The main argument that Trump had going for him before the coronavirus appeared was the low level of unemployment, booming economy, high stock market, so forth. That's obviously been replaced by a historically, in many ways unprecedented economic crisis. But, I think most importantly, it was just the completely incompetent handling of the health crisis itself that even for, well, not, so I'll get into not for the hardcore supporters, but certainly for, those Republicans that voted for him tactically because they wanted other things that he was going to bring. This is, this is a policy failure that's very hard to excuse. The United States today has, it represents like a quarter to a third of all coronavirus deaths in the world as a whole, in terms of testing, per capita, in terms of many other measures. The United States has just performed miserably. And although Trump himself is trying to declare victory and a good job done, I think that it's not something that fools at least a certain part of the public. Now, that means that I think that in terms of America's international position, if the Democrats do retake the White House, the damage to international institutions, I think, can be limited because Biden, is a very traditional, center-left politician. He believes in internationalism, and so, the Paris Accords, NATO, the security arrangements with Japan and Korea, all of these things have been kind of on hold, with allies hoping that we would come back after 4 years. And I think to some extent, some of that can be restored, although I don't think it's really ever going to go back to the way it was before 2016. So in that respect, I think that things will change. But there are a lot of reasons for thinking that even a pretty decisive Democratic sweep in November is really not going to fix our problems. And there are a number of reasons for that. So one clear one is just the election itself. It's not clear that we can hold a free and fair election in November in conditions of the pandemic. And here the epidemiological characteristics that we're coming to understand are really important, because it now appears that the disease is, it's actually not as lethal as many people thought initially, because as there's been more testing, it's turned out that actually a lot more people are infected. Now, a lot of conservatives took this as saying, well, this was an unjustified panic because the death rate is actually not that high. But in a way, that actually makes the disease more dangerous because it is much more contagious than other kinds of flus, or certainly than something like Ebola or other kinds of viruses. And if you think about the social and political impact of a disease that is highly contagious but not that lethal, it's very bad because people won't take it seriously. And in fact, that's fed a narrative on the right that actually the entire pandemic is a kind of fraud, or has been grossly exaggerated by the enemies of the president and so forth. And that's also been driving a lot of the protests against shut-ins and so forth, because a lot of people don't see anybody sick around them, especially in more rural communities, and they say, you know, why are we bothering with this? And that feeds, you know, various conspiracy theories about what's happening. And I think that, you know, increasingly, you know, since the disease is really not going to go away, the economic damage becomes greater. The you know, even with the president and various governors encouraging people to go back to work, the conditions for that just aren't there. Even if they're allowed to, a lot of people aren't going to want to go eat in restaurants or go shopping or go to crowded, you know, sports events and this sort of thing. And it means that the economic part of the crisis is going to continue, you know, for the indefinite future. Now, I think that that combination of characteristics then leads you to this cognitive crisis that I think we're in, which I think is really one of the things that really makes this moment very different from previous, you know, we've been polarized for 20 years, but I would say that the cognitive landscape in the United States and in the world more generally has really changed. And that's really, I think, the product of the rise of the internet interacting with the social polarization. And you know, in terms of causality, it's very hard to say that the directionality goes particularly one way or the other, but they've clearly interacted, because what the internet has done is take away all of the intermediaries that used to filter, verify, confirm, and, you know, ensure the quality of the information that got out to people. And this is actually very important in terms of social learning. Quite frankly, social learning is an elite-driven thing. So, you know, I'll give you an example of the Great Depression. Great Depression started with the stock market crash in October 1929. It really rolled on, and people did not recognize that the existing policies that were being pushed by the Hoover administration, namely tight money and a balanced budget, actually weren't the correct solution. They weren't the correct policy solution to a situation of liquidity trap and, you know, everything that was happening at that point. And the crisis got deeper. It evolved into a banking crisis in 1931, and it was, you know, 3 years after the onset of the crisis that people suddenly realized, hey, you know, reality just doesn't correspond to the mental models we've had. And so the Roosevelt election in 1932 brings a new administration to power very decisively, and the policy begins to shift very dramatically. But it takes 3 years for that to happen. The learning that we achieved out of that was in the heads of people like Ben Bernanke, right? Or, you know, the people that actually, ironically, you know, actually was Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, you know, their history of the monetary side of the Great Depression that made people realize that in a panic like that, you want to flood the world with liquidity. You don't want tight money. But that's a very elite kind of conclusion. And, you know, fortunately in 2008, we had Ben Bernanke running the Fed, who was a historian of that period. He understood that story very well, and therefore the Fed didn't try to, you know, remove money from the system. It put money, it put liquidity into the system. And so that's the way that social learning is supposed to take place. It's really an elite, it's an elite matter, and it's kind of why you need elites really to guide policy over the long run. And that's precisely the thing that's been eroded, I think, in recent years as a result of the rise of the internet. And I think that interpreting the pandemic itself is a good case of, you know, how that cognitive confusion, you know, continues to dog us, because it's really actually hard to, you know, convince people that it's actually not safe to go out in you know, red states where there's a lot of pressure to do so, because you know, a social scientist actually would have trouble establishing clear cause and effect, you know, when the effects are very delayed from the causes, and There's a lot of noise in the data and so forth, and that means that people can interpret things according to their ideological preferences rather than, through any kind of careful examination of statistical evidence and the like. So that, I think, is a big problem that we are still dealing with. And what it means is that even if the Democrats do take over those three branches of government, you're still going to have a big problem, because a future Biden administration is going to inherit a very unhappy country in which you may start with just a contesting of the legitimacy of the election. And that actually could come from both sides. It could come from, Trump Republicans that say that, there's a lot of fraudulent voting. But, today it could also come from Democrats who say that because there was an inadequate attention to mail-in ballots and alternative ways of voting, a lot of voters didn't get represented, right? And so that's, in a way, the first obstacle that has to be overcome. But then you're going to face a situation in which the arguments over the responses to the epidemiological crisis are going to be replaced by huge disputes over the economic responses. Congress has now, tripled this year's deficit, so that we're, we added another. At the moment, it's like $2.3 trillion in new federal spending. That is very justified, but it is opening the door to, an unending series of arguments and litigation over the way that this money is going to be distributed. I think that if you look down the road, the class divisions that have already been very pronounced in this country are going to widen enormously as a result of the crisis. So for people like, I would say, everybody on this call, who's sitting at home with a good internet connection and the technological ability to, to work together online, it's not going to affect our lives. That's why, we're just now getting word that it's unlikely that Stanford is going to be able to open in person in the fall, but I've been teaching all quarter online, and it's actually just as good. So it really doesn't affect me. It doesn't hurt my income and so forth. But other people that have to actually be out there in factories and workplaces and in retail and many other places are not going to have that kind of an easy job. And as this crisis rolls on month after month, it's going to produce all sorts of forms of backlash that are very hard to predict at the moment. But if you look at prior crises, you get all sorts of delayed responses that nobody predicted at the outset of the crisis. So, for example, I just think that the whole rise of populism around the world in certain ways was the long-term consequence of the 2008 financial crisis. The rise of Trump, I suspect, probably wouldn't have happened if that crisis had been avoided in the United States and the euro crisis in Europe. So there's a lot of things that, kind of black swan type of events that we really can't foresee now, that in a prolonged crisis become much more likely than in one that is much shorter term. So that's the reason why I unfortunately ended up in this relatively pessimistic place. Normally, if you look historically at how did countries get out of situations of extreme polarization, oftentimes it required some kind of really big external shock, like a war or an invasion or an epidemic. And in many ways, in terms of opinion polling, I think you still get a majority of Americans that say that, they believe experts and they're not unhappy with the stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing. But the polarization has been reflected absolutely in responses to the crisis. I remember being particularly struck when the anti-shut-in demonstrations began by one sign in one of the demonstrations where someone was holding up a sign that says, we're not all in this together. And, you know, given the fact that it's such a cliche in a moment like this to say, yes, we're all Americans and we're all suffering jointly, that's simply not the way it's been interpreted by, you know, a certain part of the population. And so even a big shock like this, I'm not sure is going to, you know, force the kind of social rationality that you would hope for, or it may take a much longer period of time for that kind of social rationality eventually to emerge. All right, so let me stop there, and I would invite, you know, comments, questions, or, you know, anything else. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Frank. That was fascinating. Thank you. And we have about 25 minutes. We have a hard stop at noon because of Frank's schedule. So if you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, that would be much appreciated. And I'll try to get in as many people as we can. I'd also like to welcome our friends at the Tocqueville Conversations Foundation. I gather a few of them were able to join despite the technical glitch we have there. And welcome to everyone who was able to join since then. Sorry about the ragged start. So let's see who we've got here. All right, why don't we start with Nicholas lluzzi.
Yes, thank you very much.
And let's keep, I'm going to cut anybody off who makes a speech. So let's keep comments to an absolute minimum and questions crisp. Thank you.
Of course. You mentioned that one of the ways to go back against populism is through decisive elections. In these past few years, a lot of Democratic allies and nations across the world have seen struggles in such an effort. The European Parliament, with its centrist parties falling in both their numbers, same with the Germans. Israel has had 3 elections so far, and Italy's been flip-flopping across its coalitions. What if we've come to a place where the people know what they want, but what they want is fundamentally different from each other in so many areas across an individual nation?
Well, look, that's obviously going to be one of the things that determines the nature of politics, right? So if you study in comparative politics party systems, one of the truisms is that it depends on the existing social cleavages. And if you've got a lot of cleavages or cross-cutting cleavages, it's going to yield a legislature that has lots of multiple parties, and it's very hard to come to consensus and so forth. So obviously, that's been a big problem. It's been a problem in Spain, in Israel, as you've said, and in the United States, I would say, where Republicans and Democrats have been pretty evenly divided. So there's certain things you can do to mitigate that institutionally. Like Larry Diamond and I are both big fans of ranked choice voting because, you know, part of what accentuates the polarization in American politics is our first past the post voting system. And if you allowed, if you made it easier for people to vote for third parties, there's some possibility that the left wing of the Republican Party and the right wing of the Democratic Party, or the left wing of the Democratic Party, could split off, and you'll ease a little bit of the polarity. But I don't think any comparative political scientist would say that that's ever going to solve the problem if your fundamental cleavages are so deep. And that's why countries that are organized around fixed identity groups like Lebanon, or like Bosnia, or like many countries in the Middle East, really have a lot of trouble dealing with democracy, because they've got fundamentally split populations that really aren't ever going to achieve anything more than the most superficial consensus. And one of my concerns in the United States is that, and I think this is actually even more true in certain European countries, where you are seeing the growth of sort of parallel immigrant communities that really don't integrate well, into the broader body politic, you're seeing this gradual drift into this more rigid identity-based form of politics. And so we need to do whatever we can to mitigate that. And I think, you know, I don't think there's a universal solution to this, but I do think that political leadership in a certain way can overcome some of that, because really what's required is the creation of a narrative that would anchor national identity in a more universal set of values and stories that would be accessible to people on both sides of a particular polarization. And unfortunately, you know, for opportunistic politicians, it's hard to do that, and it's much easier to exploit, you know, people's feelings of grievance that then anchor people more firmly in the polarizations. So I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfying answer, but, you know, it's a hard problem to, you know, to overcome.
Great. Next question. I think Anna's iPad probably means Anna Palacio. Is that right, Anna? Would you like to?
Sorry, yeah. You know, all this has been so sudden that this was never meant to be a projection to the world. It was my private iPad. My question is, I want to be optimistic. Let's assume that elections will go well, and that there will be a clear win for the Democrats. And I absolutely, I agree that there will be a different approach, a more, I would say, international institutions minded, international agreements minded. But I think that you Americans, and this is the American interest, you have to tell us Europeans that we are not going to go to the situation ex ante. And Frank, yes, I mean, NATO is there, but remember the farewell speech of 2011 by Gates, and he said basically the same things that this administration and the Obama administration was. Of course, Obama was so attractive, we would have voted for him. My question is, don't you think that the next administration has to create with us Europeans other frameworks on cyber, on health, on multilateralism, on all areas, and not cling to NATO as the only institutionalized bilateral, I would say, forum?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Good to see you again. So I think that the repairing of relations with Europe is going to be much harder, and I think it's completely correct to say that we're simply not going to go back to the situation under Obama under any circumstances. I think that the foreign policies of Obama and Trump actually are more similar to each other than many people recognize, because both of them really wanted to get out of the Middle East. Both of them really wanted to reduce overall the burden of, you know, global leadership. And I think that that's not in certain ways going to change if Biden is the president. Furthermore, I think that everybody that likes internationalism has been telling themselves, well, 4 years of Trump we can survive, 8 years we can't. I'm not sure that he hasn't already done enough damage in 4 years that it's going to take quite a while before Europeans actually come to trust Americans again, because they're going to say, well, look, you still got this big block of voters that, you know, take these crazy positions on international cooperation, and they could come back at any moment. And, you know, can we really believe in American commitments? You know, maybe 2 years from now, the Republicans will come storming back, and, you know, where will we be? And so I think those are all legitimate. But on your basic question, should we fundamentally rethink some of these international institutions? I think it's, you know, it would be a good thing to do. I do think a crisis like this presents certain opportunities to create new institutions, just as we did after 19 45. I guess, though, that my feeling has been that we're in such a defensive position that, and there's always this big transitional cost when you move from one set of institutions to a new one. And there's a lot of things going on in the world that require immediate attention. If you go through that kind of transition too quickly before the ground has been adequately prepared, I think there are dangers of discontinuity, like sanctions against Russia or the whole, situation in Eastern Europe. So I would say that I've just felt that defending, existing institutions, as imperfect as they are the agenda for the time being. But I do think that in the longer run, yes, it is worthwhile thinking about, what we could possibly replace them with.
Wonderful. All right, next I've got Nicole Penn. Nicole, you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry if you can't see my video. There we go. Hello. So I wanted to ask if you think that there's any opportunity during this period to look at federalism perhaps as a key to addressing the level of polarization, the problems with polarization that we have. When it comes to epidemic planning, is there space, particularly in our nation, to accept that, policies in Texas are going to look different than policies in New York? And is that perhaps a path to letting people feel like they have a say in their government, they have a say in their policies, and perhaps temper down the nationalization of politics that seems to exacerbate polarization? I mean, it would take a lot of wind out of the sails, perhaps, of people who are furious that policies in New York don't look the same as in their own county, but maybe that's what's needed to calm these raging tensions. But is that possible in the course of an epidemic? I'm not sure.
Oh, sure. So I think that's actually what's been going on. I mean, I think that actually, in the absence of any real leadership from Washington, governors have taken over, and they've done it in both directions, both in terms of early lockdowns like in California or in terms of early openings like in Georgia. I think, as I think through, we obviously have to open up the country again, and it's obviously not going to be safe. And I think that there's so much that we don't know about the likelihood of a second wave and how deep it's going to be and how that interacts with the existing capacity in the health system, that any opening, I think, is going to necessarily have to be very experimental. And therefore, in a sense, federalism is a good way of doing that. And in any event, the federal government doesn't have the power to stop it. It didn't have the power to stop the early shutdowns, and it really, I think it's kind of on the wrong side, just as a rhetorical stance right now in terms of the opening up. But even if, or put it another way, Trump does not have absolute authority over the states in this matter, no matter how many times he's tried to assert something like that. So I think it's going to happen anyway. The thing that worries me is really whether there is a kind of, like I said, socially rational evaluation. If the people that believe, in the seriousness of the epidemic are correct, then states that open up prematurely are basically going to be punished for that, because they'll see their infection rates rising. And, if they respond to that kind of non-ideologically, but really look at the health data seriously and then make adjustments, I think that's what we would hope for. Under current circumstances, that's not something we can take for granted. The final thing I'd say is there really are certain functions that only the federal government can do. So ramping up national, preparedness in terms of funding vaccine research, in terms of testing or making adequate levels of testing available is something really where the government could put a lot of time and effort into, and that's where I think the big failure has occurred over the last 3 months.
Wonderful. Next we have Yulia Joja.
Hi, thank you. This is Yulia Joja from SAIS and Associate Professor at Georgetown. Professor Fukuyama, you talked a little bit earlier about the cognitive crisis the US is facing and the right-wing narrative here in the context of the pandemic. I found that very interesting. I have heavily witnessed over the last few weeks in Europe and to a lesser extent here in the United States, the opposite of the right-wing narrative that is sort of a compelling, very powerful and interesting left narrative. That is, Western governments and media are controlling individuals, the population. They are pushing unnecessary measures and enacting disciplinary power in a Foucauldian way over us. This is, of course, a cognitive dissonance because mostly it targets the West, with everybody in this narrative citing Sweden as the way to go. But it's actually too early for conclusions, as scientists show us. Can you tell us a little bit more about your views and this left-wing narrative?
Yeah, well, I think that it's likely that that's going to gain a lot of traction among a lot of people. I think that, this is what I was saying about long-term effects. Sometimes these interpretive narratives just take a while to emerge, but the more unhappy people are, and the more confused government responses seem to be, the more traction they're going to gain. So I would expect that something like this is likely to emerge, just as, if you listen to the narratives coming out of the American left, in the primary campaign, a lot of the Sanders supporters, a lot of that stuff sounded pretty crazy to me, but, nonetheless, it took hold among a lot of people. Whether these types of interpretations will be symmetrically distributed between right and left, I don't know. Up till now, I think it's really been the right that has been more guilty of this. But that's the problem with our cognitive space right now, where a lot of these kind of conspiratorial ways of thinking can gain a lot of traction. And indeed, sometimes they're right.
Seth Kaplan?
Thank
Seth,
you. Thank you, yes. It's been very instructive. You've spoken a lot about the problems of polarization in institutions today and in your writing. You haven't spoken as much about the changes in our society or the failure of some of our, I want to say, elite-driven policies to serve the needs of parts of our society. Would you like to comment more on what ought to change so that more parts of our society feel included and more parts of our society do not feel so much anger that they elect Trump and things of that nature?
Yeah, well, there's a simple answer to that. I think that you need to overall increase the level of social protections funded by basically increased, taxation on people that actually have the means to pay for it, beginning with the healthcare system, right? So it was completely crazy that the United States was the only rich country that did not have some kind of government-mandated universal healthcare system. Obama tried to create that in 2010 with the ACA, and he succeeded, but then, that became the victim of, the partisan polarization, because the Republicans then spent the next several years trying to dismantle Obamacare. But I think the crisis demonstrates, the terrible consequences of not having such a universal healthcare system in place. But I would say the following, and this is where the cognitive irrationality comes in. even before the crisis, many white voters in the South who were among the biggest beneficiaries of the ACA continued to vote for Republican politicians who vowed to dismantle the ACA, right? So they were voting directly against their own health and economic self-interest. And that's just one of many instances of the way in which this kind of cultural identity politics, the need to identify with the policies of your team, override any kind of individual rational self-interest. And that's why I think that if the Democrats return to power, they're clearly going to campaign on health. That's the number one issue. That's what got them their House majority in 2018. And in the middle of a pandemic, that's such an obvious no-brainer. And they're going to try to move, in the direction that I would approve of. But is that going to then get the core Trump voters, these working class people that actually don't have health insurance, is that going to make them wake up one morning and say, wow, the Democrats are really a great party. I'm going to vote for them the next time around. I think that's it's not obvious that that's going to happen, or if it does happen, it's going to take a very long time for, that mental, it's kind of a change in cultural affiliations. It's not impossible, because that's really what happened after 1932 in the United States with the building of the New Deal coalition, but I don't think it's going to happen, very easily.
Bill Clifford?
Thanks very much for this excellent discussion. It seems to me that one of the potentially most dangerous periods for this country could be between the election and Inauguration Day. I think it's imaginable that if Trump loses a close election, a whole host of things could happen. You'd have daily discourse like we've had it on steroids, incompetence, cries that it's a hoax, the latest hoax. There could be a spike in disease, a market meltdown, a foreign policy crisis, or any of those in combination. I wonder how you see that period, to what extent norms might be even blasted there, or to what extent our institutions are resilient for weird outcomes.
Well, look, your guess is as good as mine. I think that in the short run is probably the chief political danger, is actually being able to hold a free and fair election that grants access to all, voters, and whose legitimacy is not contested. But I think there's really very powerful forces that will, stand in the way of that. I think my main hope is that the Democrats will do so well that it's not going to be a close election, that it'll be kind of a blowout, and it'll be very hard to pursue this narrative, that somehow the election was stolen. But, that could easily not happen. I think one of the things that worries me and a lot of other people is just the issue of violence, right? So you saw those pictures of people showing up in the Michigan State Capitol with semi-automatic weapons. Now, one of the things that's actually quite striking about the last 3.5 years is that there hasn't been that much violence, despite the deep polarization and the kind of hatreds that exist on both sides. If you compare that, to things in my experience, like the late 60s and early 70s, when you had assassinations and riots and, students getting shot on university campuses and this sort of thing, it is kind of remarkable that we haven't seen much of that. But it seems to me right now, given the dry tinder that exists out there, it's not hard to imagine scenarios in which you actually could spark this sort of thing, right? Like, you got all these people showing up for a demonstration that are heavily armed, and, a firecracker goes off or something, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of shooting and people get killed, and then that begins its own dynamic of recrimination and the like. So I think, there's a lot to worry about in terms of, people taking matters into their own hands if they don't feel that the election was a legitimate one.
Wow. Well, I'm afraid we're at 11:59, a minute away from our hard stop. Frank, would you like to say anything in conclusion?
Well, look, I would say cheer up, because there really are a number of positive things that could come out of this crisis. I mean, the first thing is actually just a different president next year. That in itself, I think, will be a big achievement and step forward. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of work that still needs to be done, so we're not out of the woods yet.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Frank. Thank you all. And we hope to see you at other events. And sorry about the glitch, and we'll be sure to thoroughly test that, which I thought we'd done before we try that again. But thank you all. Good day. Bye-bye.